around 2 years ago, I was browsing online on a typical Saturday evening, and I came across an intriguing post on the Tolkien Collector's Guide forum, dated September 2019. Someone was asking for a copy of a book entitled Das erste Jahrzehnt, ein Almanach, or the First Decade 1977-1987, an Almanac, produced by Klett Cotta, a German publishing house. The post claimed that in that book was a copy of a poem written by Tolkien entitled The Complaint of Mîm the Dwarf. And while the replies that followed the original post were helpful in tracking down a copy of the almanac, no other information on the poem itself was forthcoming, except that this version of the poem in the almanac had been translated into German by Hans J. Schutz, entitled Mîm's Klage. Now, as most of you know, Mîm is a character featured in both the Silmarillion and the Children of Húrin. He is what Tolkien calls a petty-dwarf, who were a diminutive race of dwarves. In the stories, he is involved with Túrin and his band of outlaws, and later on is ultimately slain by Túrin's father Húrin in the halls of Nargothrond. Suffice to say, I was hooked. I wanted to learn more about this lost poem by Tolkien, especially since it spoke of a character from his mythology. And I did what I loved doing best. I researched, and I looked and browsed and cross-referenced Tolkien's letters, chronologies, biography, anything I could get my hands on to try and find any reference to this work. But I was unsuccessful. Eventually, by sheer insistence and determination, and a refined Google search, I discovered another forum claiming a rediscovered lost work by Tolkien. YouTube links were provided to a video which supposedly contained the full English text. Unfortunately, by the time I had discovered this post, the trail had gone cold, so much so that the video links had long since been removed. Nevertheless, I learned a bit more about the poem, and it seemed to be a genuine piece, conceived and written down by Tolkien and eventually translated into German for this publication. And while I had originally suspected the original to be lost, it did in fact appear as if the English version might still be lurking somewhere, hidden, unpublished, gathering dust in the Tolkien archives. I had also managed to find out that the J.R.R. Tolkien Companion and Guide, compiled by Wayne G. Hammond and Christina Scull, contained a very brief entry description on the complaint of Mîm the Dwarf. So I grabbed my 2006 edition of the book and searched, again and again and again. I even found reference online to the actual page number, but no matter how much I scanned every word and letter on page 261, I never found anything remotely close to Mîm, until I eventually discovered that this entry had actually only been added in the revised 2017 edition of the book. I contemplated long and hard on this, and eventually succumbed to the pressures that come when you cherish a deep passion for anything Tolkien. So I hunted down that particular almanac and acquired a copy for myself. Now, my knowledge of German is unfortunately extremely limited, and I was unable to fully appreciate the words printed on the handful of pages before me. Having said that, however, I was ecstatic that I had in my collection something not many Tolkien readers had read before. And neither would I, it seemed, unless I taught myself some German. And although the language barrier remained, I discovered much more information on the complaint of Mîm the Dwarf, which in reality was not just a 26-verse poem written in decasyllabic rhyming couplets, at least the German translation, but the poem was also accompanied by a 3.5-page prose fragment, and was clearly a continuation or an amalgamation to the poem itself. Among the foreign words, I glimpsed the name Mîm several times, together with the word Zwerg, which I somehow subconsciously remembered it as being the term for dwarf. And I also found the name Tarn Ailwin, which, as many readers of the Silmarillion will be aware of, is a mountain lake on the highlands of Dorthonion in the lands of Beleriand. More specifically, the place in which Barahir, father of the famed Beren, and his band of outlaws are forced to flee from after an attack by orcs. It was an exciting, thrilling moment. Finally, something visible, concrete to latch onto, no matter how little the fragments of information were. Yet after those encouraging revelations, somehow nothing ever came about with the book, and from then onwards my copy of the almanac remained lovingly stored on my bookshelves. That was until a few weeks ago when I found myself looking at my bookshelf and a little idea sprang to mind. I reasoned that if we never got to see a published version of The Complaint of Mîm the Dwarf, I'll never know what those words in that book actually meant. And given my love for all things poetry, I embarked on a small project and attempted to do my own translation of the text. As I said before, my knowledge of German is disastrous, and my skills as a language translator were limited to a few amateur exercises which I used to attempt for fun years back. So my first port of call was a number of German-English dictionaries and the ever-convenient online translator. I started to transcribe the text from the poem and cross-referencing each word to its corresponding English counterpart. And step by step, the first few verses of the poem began to reveal themselves to me. Mîm and the reasons for his lamentations were unlocked, and each line demonstrated Tolkien's excellent skill of word and language, aware as I was that my English translation was far from ideal. It was a corrupted rendition, so to say, of a translation from a translation. Still, I got a glimpse, a tiny glimmer of the potential beauty of this unpublished work. The poem, now sufficiently legible for me to appreciate each verse and meaning, transformed into this powerful lyric about a wronged petty-dwarf whose memory of forging jewels and hardships in exile resonates all the more powerful, especially when one is aware of this character's past from the Silmarillion and the Children of Húrin. As is the case with much of Tolkien's poetry, this poem was clearly evocative, atmospheric, powerful, and resonant. So, following that initial exercise of a very basic translation, it was time to refine it even more. I wanted to capture as much as possible Tolkien's own poetic style, whilst at the same time maintain as much as possible the use of rhyming couplets for the verses. I confess this was a really fun stage, as I began experimenting with word changes, playing with tonality and sentence structure, and polishing as much as possible the final aesthetic of the poem. So here's my reading of my own translation from the German version known as Mîm's Klage. Although the title in English should be The Complaint of Mîm the Dwarf, which seems to be the original as Tolkien wrote it, I opted for my own interpretation of The Lamentations of Mîm the Dwarf. In addition, this is of course my own translation and in no way attempts to better, replace, or even consider itself to be on the same level as Tolkien originally wrote it, which until now we cannot know how it reads out. So here it goes. Under a mountain in forbidden land, a deep cave lay, filled out with sand. Outside his home, Mîm stood one eve. His back was crooked, his beard was grey. Long paths he roamed, homeless and cold, the petty-dwarf Mîm, 200 years old. All that he wrought by his own hand, with burin and chisel, in toil without end, had been snatched by fiends, and only his life and a few things of craft were left to him, and the long blade sheathed and poisoned too under a torn cloak. His clouded eyes blinked, still red from smoke, for, clogged with thorns and heather, they had at last cruelly set fire to his hallways, and so he came out, choking and almost vomiting. Mîm spat into the sand and thus spoke.
Tink, 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 tonk, 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 tink. No time to eat, no time to drink, tonk, tink. Tink, tonk, no time, tonk, tink, no time to waste. No time to sleep, no night nor day, but only haste. Silver and gold only, hammered and bent to shape, and small hard stones, glittering and cold. Tink, tink, green and yellow, tink, tink, blue and white. Under my hands sprouted and quietly grew long flowers and leaves, while red eyes glowed in animals and birds among the branches and blossoms.
The poem offers some very tantalizing details about the character of Mîm. For instance, it is nowhere else stated in Tolkien's works, as far as I'm aware, that the dwarf was 200 years old. What is also fascinating is the reference to Mîm's poisoned blade, which, as is described later on in the prose fragment, it is in fact a knife with poison runes on its blade. Now, upon my first reading of the translated poem, I thought this was a clear reference to the dwarfs dwelling in Amon Rûdh, that hilltop on which Mîm's secret treasury was to be found, and where, according to the children of Túrin and the Silmarillion, he leads Túrin and his band of outlaws to shelter during the winter. And this appeared to be the case due to the reference to flowers and red eyes towards the end of the poem, and the use of the German word bluten, which in my original translation I had written down as to bleed, but upon including the letter U umlaut, which is a distinct letter from the more recognized U, the word bluten changes to bloom. I found this connection between bleed and blooming flowers to be an interesting metaphor and parallel, and an almost direct reference to Tolkien's Ceregon, that type of red plant of which in the Silmarillion and the Children of Túrin is said to grow on Amon Rûdh, where from a distance at sunset it appears as if there is blood on the hilltop. But while the translated short poem hinted at these locations, events, themes of longing, suffering, despair and hardship, the subject of the dwarves' lamentation became more clear once the rest of the prose translation followed. After the poem is concluded, Tolkien provides a 3-page account told in the first person, as Mîm reflects on the difficulties he has endured after being attacked and forced out of his home in Tarn Ailwin. This is an interesting point, given that we have no indication as to when this poem and account were originally written. We are therefore unable to place precisely the complaint of Mîm the Dwarf within a specific timeline of the Silmarillion chronology. Was Mîm actually forced out of his home by orcs, or perhaps elves, which would explain his particularly deep hatred for them? Or else could it have been men, perhaps Barahir and his band of outlaws after the Dagor Bragollach? Once again, in the prose fragment, the German translation refers to the word Menschen, which I have translated as menfolk or humans. But whoever these may be is ultimately never clarified. Ironically, whilst the prose narrative furnishes us with more details, it raises even more questions. And here's just a tiny snippet of my translation of this narrative fragment in prose that accompanies the poem.
Did I sleep long? I do not know how much time has passed. The fires of the forge were extinguished, but I was awakened by the choking smoke. Menfolk came and stole everything I owned, the ore that I had long ago dug out from the rocks, the heaps of precious stones, and they carried away my chest. And under an old tattered cloak and its black sheath, my hidden knife with poison runes on its blade. Often I sharpened it, spat on the edge until it shone under the cruel stars in desolate places.
It's been 130 years since his birth, and J.R.R. Tolkien keeps on surprising us, delighting us and exciting us with his unparalleled skill to write and craft stories, forging together words and ideas with a supreme command of the English language, which makes this fun little exercise I undertook one of immense pleasure and sense of satisfaction.